Hey there, friends. So I had a request for videos that talk you through some of the more basic yoga poses, kind of talking through points of alignment and tips for helping you sort of achieve the best version of that in your body. And so for today's video, I'm going to cover mountain pose, chair pose, standing forward fold, triangle, and extended side angle. I'll talk you through each one, and then we'll kind of put them together in a couple of different flows. I've got a couple of yoga blocks here, and I'll also give you some options where you might use a block to help work on some things, or just for assistance to feel better in the pose. And just one little disclaimer, I guess, for this Yoga Basics video and for those to come. I used to think that there was one way that you were supposed to do a pose, right? That the rules of alignment were black and white, set in stone, and that's really not the case. Thankfully, these days, more yoga teachers are basing their teaching on science and an evidence-based approach to body mechanics. So you may hear some things in these videos that surprise you because you've always heard one thing or another. It turns out a lot of that stuff is really just not good advice, not necessarily fear-mongering. Our bodies are resilient and are meant to move in a lot of different ways. So there you go. So we're going to start with mountain pose. You'll see mountain pose a couple of different ways depending on the style of yoga. So traditionally, feet together is what I've seen the most in traditional styles like maybe Iyengar or Ashtanga. And you could do feet together with the heels slightly separate. Now, if you just take a moment to notice the difference when you bring your feet all the way together versus when you have things a little bit more apart, it's definitely a different feel in how your body stacks up over its base, right, which is your feet. When you have your feet all the way together, it's a narrower base, obviously, than with your feet, say hip width or so. And so for that reason, feet together might feel a little bit harder. And it also may feel a little bit more like a balance challenge, right? Because if you have a narrower base down on the bottom, that makes things harder to balance. So that's one thing that you could experiment with, and I'm not here to tell you that one way is better than another. I'm just trying to give you a little bit of information about why you might make one choice versus the other. My personal preference is feet about hip width. Make sure you're looking down at your feet and thinking about spreading your toes, which should feel like, again, a more stable base for things. And feet straight ahead doesn't have to be 100%. For some of us, it feels a little bit more comfortable to stand with the toes just a smidge turned out. Obviously, you don't want to go too far in one way or the other because that will affect other things up the line. So baseline, toes straight ahead. Yeah. Okay. So as we start to stack up our mountain pose from there, I'll turn to the side. Mountain pose, I just feel like, is one of those positions where you can really sort of check in with your overall posture and how you're standing, and that goes for general standing in your life, not just when you're on your mat doing yoga. So one thing that you might draw some awareness to is what's going on with your lower back and your pelvis. And some of us have a tendency to tilt things more one way, anterior tilt, or the other, posterior tilt. Your pelvis tilts in both of those ways. It's supposed to. It's not bad. spend too much time in one and don't do the other. So the awareness I like to have generally in a pose like mountain pose is somewhere in the middle of my range of motion between an anterior tilt and a posterior tilt, right? Somewhere in the middle, somewhere neutral for the lower back with the tilt of the pelvis, your lower back is supposed to have a slight curve, right? So there's no need to excessively think tailbone down in order to flatten your lower back, because that could be problematic. So that's one thing that you might just kind of check in with and find something that seems like it's kind of in the middle. If you come on up the line, after you draw some awareness to how your pelvis is tilting, that can affect, right, other things. So if you tend to tilt into too much of an anterior tilt, place more of a back bend, you might have ribs flaring forward up front. So as you go toward neutral, that might fix itself. Coming on up the line, sometimes I really haven't seen anyone who's excessively too much with their shoulders back. Generally, it's more shoulders forward. So you might roll your shoulders back just to feel that. Taking that up the line further, generally, kind of like with the shoulders being forward, sometimes the neck can be forward. So I've said this to people in class sometimes. If I were to come up to you, if you had a ponytail, or pretend you have a ponytail right at the back of your head, and pull back on your ponytail so that your ears move back more toward being over your shoulders, that gives you a little bit more of a neutral placement for kind of stacking things up in your body in mountain pose. So check in with all those little bits and pieces. Sometimes you will see different arm positions in mountain pose. I always learned to externally rotate the arms so they're facing forward with the palms facing forward. And I kind of like how that feels. The Sanskrit name for mountain pose is Tadasana. And so I forget who I got this from, but it's like saying ta-da, right? Here I am in mountain pose. And I think that feels really good and strong and energetic. So if that's what you're going for, if that's your intention, is to bring a little bit more energy into your mountain pose, you might try that, or you can just rest your arms by your sides. If you want to make your mountain pose more energetic still, you can really feel those feet pressing down more and feel the quads engage, the front part of your thighs engage a little bit more. That might help you feel your kneecaps lift a little bit. You can just notice those things and see how that feels. Yeah? All right, so that's mountain pose in a nutshell. Yeah? And it's a great pose. I think sometimes it's overlooked or glossed over. It's not really just standing there, right? Because we could be all wonky just standing there. So it should feel, strong and tall, like a mountain. All right. From there, we'll take it into chair pose. And I'm going to come up to the top of my mat, since that's more often than not where we're doing mountain pose and chair pose. Chair pose is one of my favorite poses, which my regular yoga students know. I've been called Queen of Chair Pose, which I always think it's funny then to learn how many people hate chair pose. Just like mountain pose, depending upon your teacher, the style of yoga that you're practicing, you may see different iterations of chair pose. Like mountain pose, some more traditional styles of yoga, like Iyengar and Ashtanga, do chair pose with feet more together instead of hip width. And for chair pose, actually, sometimes I like it with feet together as opposed to mountain pose, because it's a really strong pose and you can kind of squeeze your legs together. Other days, just depending on the day, I might do it with feet hip width. So let's kind of work up the body. So chair pose, probably one of the reasons why people hate it is because it's fatiguing for the quads, right? Because we are bending the knee. So it's, you know, it's a type of squat per se. So one of the things that you can experiment with to kind of see how your body feels about chair pose is how much you're bending your knees, right? So if you look, say, in Iyengar's Light on Yoga, which is a kind of a standard text for yoga poses, he is really, really low down in that chair pose, like almost to where his thighs are parallel to the ground, I think. And I really don't see very many people doing chair pose that way typically. However, you could, if your intention was to really work your legs, maybe just kind of bend your knees back and forth and kind of see where your natural stopping point is, and that might be a good place for chair pose. One of the things that I was always told back in the day was that you had to draw your knees back so that you could see your toes. And typically that's what my body does naturally. Depending on your body, and sometimes that is an Achilles area issue with squats, right? Because things can get kind of tight there. That's not always possible for everyone to always keep the knees behind the toes. And that's one of those myths that we've been kind of fear-mongered about, right? It's not necessarily problematic to have your knees be forward of your toes. When you walk upstairs, your knees are always past your toes. It's true story. So you don't necessarily have to be afraid that you're gonna hurt yourself if you can't see your toes in chair pose. Really, it's okay. So you can bend your knees as much as you like. And then you might even experiment with bringing the knees forward some and bringing the knees back some and observe how that feels. When I bring my knees forward, I can feel the calves more. When I bring them back, not so much. And it's not about right or wrong, it's just about having some options and playing with that and seeing which one feels better for you. Doesn't have to be the same one that I choose. Kind of working up the line from there. Just like in mountain pose where I said, kind of be aware of what your pelvis is doing. When I did my yoga teacher training, we were told in chair pose to tuck the tailbone under, like excessively. I remember specifically the lead teacher for my teacher training coming up to me and like really trying to get me to tuck my pelvis under. And now when I do that, it just kind of seems a little bit ridiculous, right? Your pelvis tilts in both directions. Maybe in chair pose, do a little bit back and forth, kind of cat-cow-like. And then see where things fall naturally for you. Somewhere in the middle, see where it feels good for you. Now that's not to say if you have more of a tendency to go in one direction or the other, that maybe if you tend to always be in a little back bend with your butt sticking back, maybe a little bit of a tuck serves you. Vice versa, if you tend to always over round and you're losing the nice curve in your lower back, maybe you need to send your tailbone back a little bit so you get a little bit more of that curve, right? Some things to think about. The next part of chair pose that I think is a little bit difficult for people, and sometimes I'll say in my classes when we're in chair pose and then maybe taking it somewhere else, is if your arms get tired here in chair pose, you can do something different. So arms get tired in chair pose, even though it's a squat, right? It's a leg pose. And that's 100% normal. One thing that you could do, this is a little Iyengar yoga trick that I experienced really coming from mountain pose, but we lift our arms up in mountain pose too, You can practice holding a block between your hands on the wide width, which should be about shoulder width, right? And you can do it from mountain pose to chair, kind of back and forth. You will feel your shoulders burn. And that is not really an arm strength issue, right? Because the block's not heavy. Really, it's a shoulder mobility issue. So if that's you, I've got some other videos that work on shoulder mobility and shoulder stretching. So that might be worthwhile for you to do if lifting your arms up is difficult or painful when you're doing chair pose or from mountain pose. And it does feel different in chair and in mountain, right? Because the body's doing something else, the torso's in a little bit of a different position, right? So it will feel different. And another thing to think about too, when you lift your arms up overhead, another one of those crazy things that yoga teachers have said forever and a day that isn't necessarily the best thing to say all the time. Kind of like tuck your tailbone, right? You should not always tuck your tailbone. Sometimes it's fine. When you lift your arms, one of the things we used to say is keep your shoulders down, right? Don't lift your shoulders when you lift your arms. Well, I can't get my arms all the way up if I don't let my shoulders come with, right? And shoulder elevation is one movement that the shoulder joint is supposed to do. Yeah, it becomes a problem if we're constantly like this, but nobody's really doing that right. Your shoulders do not have to be down all the time. You can lift your shoulders when you lift your arms. Yeah, promise, it's gonna be okay. Okay, so let's see, from mountain and chair pose, let's go from there. Another place that we might go fairly often in a yoga class from either of those poses is a standing forward fold. So, depending on your foot placement in your mountain pose or your chair pose, be that feet together or hip width or so, you can keep the same distance of your feet for that, right? I already said my preference is hip width for mountain pose, and sometimes I mix it up with chair pose. So I'll do hip width for my forward fold. Now think about how you would fold a piece of paper. I use my little yoga notebook here. So we are trying to bring two pieces together, right, when we're folding. So when we're doing a standing forward fold or any kind of forward fold in yoga, we're trying to hinge at the hip creases and fold together the legs and the torso. Now, unless you are Gumby and super flexy in your hamstrings, it's pretty tricky. So, one of the ways I like to think about accessing that a little bit more is to bend the knees, right? And you've probably heard that a million times. So you might kind of from chair pose, from a bent knee position, right? Keep the knees bent and fold your torso to your thighs. So depending on the length of your thighs and the length of your torso, you might feel different body parts touching than I do. But I can feel my chest right above my knees from here. So this is the forward fold. My knees are bent quite a bit. If your hands don't touch down, blocks, different heights, right? And then from there, you can experiment with more straightening of the legs, less bend in the knees, depending on how folded you can stay. And you will probably feel, as you go through the course of, say, a vinyasa class where there's lots of standing forward folds, maybe the first one, your knees are bent a lot, right? And gradually over the course of the practice, you get a little bit straighter as your hamstrings warm up a bit, right? Another thing to think about in forward folds is, what's my spine doing? typically, for most of us that are not Gumby-like, we are probably going to err toward the side of more rounded spine than extended back bendy spine. It's darn near impossible to do a back bend in that position unless you're, like I said, really, really flexible. And it's really, we objectify back bends and nice straight backs in yoga. We just like put those two things on a pedestal. We really don't like to see rounded backs, right? When in fact, spinal flexion, rounded back, is one of the ways your spine is supposed to move. So don't get too stressed out or overly concerned about rounding your back, right? Because it's one of the ways that we want to be able to move. In a forward fold, like I said, we're gonna tend toward that direction, most of us, which is okay. You may end up feeling a little bit achiness in your lower back if you round too much. I can definitely attest to that, especially in other variations on forward folding. So I try to think toward the opposite direction so that I can be a little bit more neutral as opposed to overly rounded. So if you don't bend your knees enough and you're super tight, you might end up being overly rounded. If you bend your knees more, you might be able to get a little bit more neutral with your spine. Yeah? Okay. And there's lots of variations on what you could do with your hands in a forward fold. If you're just kind of starting, you can sway, grab elbows, dangle, etc. Again, hands on blocks might be helpful. Yeah. So now I'll talk about triangle and side angle, which are two very foundational, standing, strong, and stretchy yoga poses, and they really go together like peanut butter and jelly, right? They are very similar, and there's a couple of different ways that you can get into those two poses, and when we get to the flow, you'll see that. But for now, I'm going to show you how to get into, I'll do triangle first, from an upright standing, I've already got my feet wide kind of position. So I'm going to take my right foot and angle it straight ahead toward the top of the mat. My back foot is parallel-ish to the back of the mat, maybe a smidge turned in. Adjust that a little bit. There's no black and white, right? You can adjust that to your comfort for your body. Something you can also adjust is how far apart your feet are. If you, again, look at some different styles of yoga, Ashtanga, very, very short stance for triangle. I think Iyengar is a little bit longer. Some styles of yoga really do it longer. To me, it can change from day to day, kind of depending on which pose I'm doing before or after. I might have a shorter or a longer triangle. Yeah, so from here, right, I'm setting up triangle on the right side with the right leg forward. You might sort of draw some awareness to this front leg. Feel the surface of your foot rooting all over, right? So sometimes we tend to collapse inward or outward with the foot. See if you can find a little balance there. And as we go into triangle, we're not necessarily trying to bring our hand to the floor. We're just gonna let it kind of come with us as we go into position. So we'll reach the arms out. Now, in order for me to really make some space to move my spine, I'm gonna let my hips move as well. So that's one of the things that people get stuck with in triangle is they keep their hips here and then they reach and then that's kind of all they got. So if you can allow your hips to move back, you will have more room to reach forward. I hope that makes sense you can kind of make it into a little dance, right? This is the one time where I always say you can be sassy with your hips in a yoga pose. Sometimes we don't want to have sassy hips. We want to have a little bit more neutral hips, but we can kind of sass for triangle. So we've sassed our hips back. Maybe we were thinking about what the pelvis is doing and it's not too far anteriorly tilted or posteriorly tilted. I don't know if those are words. Somewhere in the middle. We let the hips move back as we reach forward. And then when you just kind of feel like you can't reach anymore, this bottom hand can just sort of hang down and the top arm can reach up. You could have a block under that bottom hand if that felt helpful. Sometimes I press the back of my fingers into that bottom leg to help me lift upward, right? Because we don't want to be hanging down, right? Triangle for me is a very open, reaching upward pose. It's a little bit of a rotation, right? And you can look up, right? Think about what we did in mountain pose where we drew the ponytail back. Make sure that you draw back before you try looking up. If that hurts your neck, don't look up. Doesn't matter. Yeah? All right, let's come on up and we'll just kind of switch sides. Taking the left foot back. All right, I'll bring a block over there just in case. All right, I'll let my hips get sassy. I'll make sure I'm not kind of in a overly extended or flexed position with the pelvis. And I'll take it down, right? And that block could be outside, inside. I feel like it gives you a little bit more room outside, personally. Or you could, again, press against your leg to help you lift. And while we're here, I'm gonna go right into side angle from here, right? Because it's very, very similar in position. Really, all you have to do to get into side angle from here is bend that front knee and reach the top arm forward. And you're there, right? To me, those two, again, go together like peanut butter and jelly. You could have your hand, that bottom hand on that block, outside, inside. Resting is typically what I will do. Yeah. And let's go up to the other side for side angle. So if you weren't in triangle already, right, you have a bent knee, and this is like a warrior two position. I do have a video already for breaking down the warrior poses. You would do that same reach that we did to get into triangle to get to side angle. Now, you can reach this top arm in a couple of different ways, right? You can sort of sweep it overhead or not. And that will feel different on your shoulder joint. If you feel like your shoulders are a little cranky, doing it this way, sort of like disco, is probably feels a little bit more comfortable. And it might depend on which arm you're talking about. And again, just like triangle, we're trying to rotate upward. And you can look up if that feels okay on your neck, but you don't have to. Bottom hand on the block, on your leg, just reaching down. Again, it doesn't have to come to the floor. Sometimes people come to the floor and they end up sort of collapsing downward, right? It's not really a downward kind of pose for me. It's more of an upward pose. So make sure that bottom hand is not down enough. And I didn't really say a whole lot about what that bent knee is doing in side angle. In general, the advice you will hear is to, when you bend your knee in any sort of a lungy position or a squat kind of thing, right, that you want to track it straight ahead and not angle it in. That kind of falls into that fear-mongering category where you don't necessarily have to be overly concerned about that. Unless you feel like it is causing you pain to go in one direction or the other, then maybe that might be something to think about. But you can kind of think of that as a baseline without necessarily being too worried about it. If you have your arm inside, you can kind of use that to press it out. If it's outside, you can press your leg into your arm, right? Or if you're resting, you can also kind of press out that way. to also be thinking of side body length, right? So as I go into triangle and I reach forward, long side, instead of bending, I'm trying to stay long. Same thing in side angle, lengthening, right? And you will feel a difference in those two poses. So I'll get into it from being down instead of going up and going into the pose. So you might feel a difference in how that feels coming from the ground up into side angle. And again, we're not necessarily trying to stay attached to the floor, right? And you could go from side angle to triangle just as easily as we went from triangle to side angle. Maybe you do a little disco move back and forth, right? And you could, do that as well. Reach your arm in different ways. For me, if you have like an injury or something to the hamstring attachment area, which is super common in yoga, maybe I'll do a video on avoiding that at some point. Getting to triangle, especially from the ground up, feels better for me in that area than coming to it from above. I don't have a great answer as to why that is, but that's my experience. So coming into triangle from here, straightening and reaching up, feels different than if I were already standing and getting into it. Yeah. Feeling this front leg, just like in mountain pose with the engagement through the quads, helping the kneecaps lift. That might be something you can experiment with. You can experiment with how much you roll your leg out, and that might be connected to what you're doing with your foot, right? And you can roll your leg out without rolling your foot out, because things can move independently of each other. Surprise, they can. Okay. I think I've covered pretty much everything that I needed to say specifically about each of those poses. So let's do a couple of little flows here. And I'm gonna move from both sides of the mat, and I'll keep my blocks out front and use them when I'm there, and then I'll use them without, or do the flow without when I'm coming from the back of the mat, just so you can kind of see the difference. Okay, so let's find mountain pose near the top of the mat. Your choice for foot placement. All right, I'm just standing up nice and tall. Let's reach the arms out wide and lift them up. Again, we can let the shoulders come up with us as we lift up here. And then let's go into our forward fold from here. And I'm gonna let my knees bend as I come down. And then I'll bend the knees more and come up to chair from there. And you can do chair, lifting your arms forward and up, or just like we did in mountain pose, out wide and up, depending on how that feels on your shoulders. And then let's forward fold again. And you can use your blocks to help you to step back. So I'm gonna step the left foot back, and I'm gonna step it about hip width. So I guess I forgot to talk about that issue in the breakdown, but about hip width as you step back will help you as you spin your heel down to get that back foot placement. Things should line up fairly well. I'm gonna come up into side angle from there, reaching over, and then to triangle. And then I'm gonna lift up and switch to side angle on the back side. I don't have my block this time. And maybe my feet are lined up like they were on the first side. Maybe they're not, and it's okay. And then triangle. step toward the back of the mat for forward fold. Another chair pose. We'll try maybe a different variation this time, maybe lower, maybe arms wide. One more fold. And then let's come all the way up. Arms reach up. And back to mountain pose. Yeah. Same basic thing, other side. Arms up. Maybe I'll reach them forward this time. And forward fold. Bend the knees for chair. Right? Maybe check where your knees are. Maybe try out something different. And then fold. Step the right foot back. Again, stepping about hip width. We'll probably-ish get your heels somewhat lined up in place, lifting up to side angle. And you don't have to have your heels lined up. Probably forgot to mention that because it's not super important. Triangle, straighten, reach up. Lift up, switch the feet for side angle on the other side. Triangle. Step forward, forward fold. Chair. Fold. All right, come all the way up, reach the arms up, and mountain pose. All right, let's do one more flow sequence. Again, starting here, starting there. From mountain pose, we're gonna go right into chair. Sit your hips back, reach up. And then we're gonna work a little balance this time. So I'm gonna lift my left foot. I'm gonna attempt to step it back hip width, but you know, that's a little trickier this time. Heel down, straighten. Hips move back, right, as I go down into triangle. Bend the knee, reach over, side angle. Lift up, straightening the leg, moving down into triangle this time. And then into side angle. And then I'm gonna try to step forward toward my left foot for that one-legged chair pose. So spinning on that back foot, finding a little chair balance, and then chair. Let's go into forward fold from there. And then all the way up, back to mountain pose. Yeah? Arms up, chair. Lift the right foot. All right, we'll step back. Heel down, straighten, hips move back as I reach into triangle. Bend the knee, arm reaches over, side angle. Lift up and switch for triangle, hips move back as I reach forward. Bend the knee, reach over, side angle. And again, I'll try that one-legged chair balance, and then chair, forward fold, all the way up. And sometimes I like to do prayer hands at the end of a sequence, coming back to mountain pose, which to me feels nice and just sort of is a nice way to end things. So we'll end it there. Let me know if you have any questions about those poses or any requests about future yoga basics videos in which poses you would like me to cover. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to practicing with you again soon. Namaste.